In 1938, Nazi Germany cleared an Austrian village off the map. Its parish register held the birth record of Adolf Hitler's father and the grave of his grandmother. Ever since, a theory has followed the ruins, that this family connection is the real reason the village had to disappear. Most historians reject it. What's certain is that Döllersheim vanished, and its people were never allowed to rebuild it. This is the Waldviertel, a farming region in Lower Austria, roughly 110 kilometers northwest of Vienna. Döllersheim had stood here since at least 1143, when its name first appears in a medieval document. It was never a large place, but it was a real one. A parish church, a school, workshops, a few taverns, a small trade in farming goods that tied it to the surrounding countryside. That history ended in March 1938, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss. Within months, the Wehrmacht identified this stretch of countryside for a new military training ground large enough for entire divisions to maneuver with tanks and artillery, and more than 40 settlements across the region. Home to nearly 7,000 people were marked for removal. The official reasoning was straightforward. The land was thinly populated, the soil poor for farming, and the winters harsh enough to double as year-round training conditions. Those practical considerations are well documented. What is disputed is a detail about this specific patch of ground, one that later gave rise to the claim that this particular landscape may have held an additional attraction for the regime. Hitler's father, Alois, was born nearby in the hamlet of Strones in 1837, the illegitimate son of a local peasant woman named Maria Schicklgruber. Because Strones had no parish church or baptismal register of its own, the birth was recorded in nearby Döllersheim. 10 years later, when Maria died, she was buried in that same village, in the graveyard of the church this episode opened on. Unlike some of the places this channel has covered, Döllersheim was never built to impress anyone. It wasn't a showcase or a political statement. It was simply a village, one of thousands like it across rural Europe, built around a church, a school, and families who worked the same land their grandparents had. Life ran on a slower clock here. This region sits in one of the coldest pockets of Lower Austria, and winters shaped everything. Planting, harvest, even how people built their homes. The parish church of Saints Peter and Paul, its oldest stonework dating to the Romanesque period and later expanded in the Gothic style, sat at the center of it all. Baptisms, weddings, funerals, all recorded in the same registry that, decades earlier, had quietly noted the birth of an illegitimate baby named Alois. Nobody living in Döllersheim in the 1920s or early 1930s had any reason to think their village was different from any other. They had no way of knowing that a name entered in their parish register 2 generations earlier would one day become inseparable from the story of their own displacement. After the Anschluss, Wehrmacht planners needed enormous stretches of land for live-fire exercises, space where whole divisions could train with tanks and artillery without civilians nearby. This part of the Waldviertel fit those requirements. Sparsely populated, agriculturally marginal, and large enough to be consolidated into a single military zone. But there's a detail historians still argue about. Years after the war, Hans Frank, once Hitler's personal lawyer, later a senior Nazi official executed for war crimes, wrote in a memoir composed in his prison cell that Hitler had asked him, back in 1930, to quietly investigate rumors about his own ancestry, specifically whether his paternal grandfather might have been a Jewish man from Graz. No independent evidence has ever confirmed Frank's story. Historians have found serious problems with his account, including the absence of reliable evidence that the family he named actually lived in Graz during the relevant period. What's real is simpler. Alois Hitler was born out of wedlock, and the original parish record in Döllersheim never named his father. That unresolved blank in the family record is where the rumor took root. The regime never openly admitted any personal motive for choosing this ground, but local officials, apparently eager to align themselves with the connection rather than distance from it, granted Hitler honorary citizenship of Döllersheim and created a symbolic grave of honor for his grandmother beside the church wall, even as the rest of the population living around that same grave was being told to leave. The evacuation unfolded in stages between 1938 and 1941. Across the wider region, 42 named settlements, along with scattered farmsteads and mills, nearly 7,000 people were forced out in total. Some who left early received replacement farms or land elsewhere. Others were left with unresolved claims that would drag on for years. Döllersheim itself, the principal settlement in the affected area, remained occupied until the final phase. By the deadline of October 31, 1941, it too had been cleared, along with the settlements administratively tied to it. The empty buildings were absorbed into the firing range. Some were damaged during German military exercises in the years that followed, while others were left standing. For the people who left, there was no single dramatic night of departure, the way it happened in some other places this channel has told stories about. Instead, there was a slow, bureaucratic unraveling. An official notice, a moving cart, a new address in a different village, and finally, a boundary line they were no longer allowed to cross. Claims over land, property, and unpaid compensation continued long after the war, but the area itself was never returned. In 1957, the training ground was formally transferred to the newly established Austrian armed forces, effectively ending any realistic hope that the former communities would be restored. What replaced Döllersheim was never another town. It was a training ground for war. In 1943, one infantry regiment and the artillery regiment of the newly formed 392nd Croatian Infantry Division were assembled and trained here, made up mostly of Croatian Home Guard soldiers under German command. The division had originally been intended for the Eastern Front, but was deployed instead to the independent state of Croatia, an Axis puppet state, where it fought Yugoslav partisans. Nearby, between the erased settlements of Edelbach and Döllersheim, a prisoner of war camp held thousands of French and Polish officers through much of the war. The parish church, whose records preserved the unresolved circumstances of Alois Hitler's birth, survived the war as a damaged shell, its walls still standing despite years of live-fire training that had already scarred the structure. Some other buildings across the abandoned settlements also remained standing when the war ended, but local accounts describe the wider destruction accelerating afterward under Soviet administration. Building materials removed and sold to demolition contractors, houses dismantled for brick, timber, and reusable fittings. By the late 1940s, much of what had survived the war years disappeared. When the war ended, Soviet forces occupied the training ground as part of their zone in Austria. Some former residents hoped, briefly, that they might finally be allowed home. They weren't. The Soviets held the site for a decade, only withdrawing when their occupation of Austria ended in 1955. In 1957, most of the land was transferred to the newly established Austrian armed forces. In 1964, the training ground received the name it still carries today, Truppenübungsplatz Allentsteig, one of Austria's largest military training areas. Döllersheim itself has never been resettled. Its officially recorded population is 0. Restoration work on the ruined church began in 1976, and by 1986 its main nave had a roof again. Since 1981, the church, cemetery, and former hospital site have stood outside the formal military exclusion zone and are generally accessible to visitors, though the access road running through the active training ground can still be closed during exercises, and viewing the church interior may require an arranged tour. In September 1986, the restored church was consecrated again, kept under its original patronage of Saints Peter and Paul, but given a new commemorative name, the Church of Peace. No marker identifies Maria Schicklgruber's original grave. The honorary marker created during the Nazi period no longer survives. And Strones, the hamlet where Alois Hitler was actually born, no longer exists as an inhabited or officially recognized village. Its name survives mainly in historical records and maps connected to his birth. Döllersheim was destroyed for a reason that was never really a secret. The Wehrmacht wanted an enormous training ground, and this stretch of a countryside fit the requirements. The narrower question is whether a family connection played any real role in that choice, or whether a coincidence hardened into legend only after the villages had already disappeared. No surviving document proves Hitler chose this ground to bury a secret about his ancestry. Most historians reject Frank's sensational claim about a Jewish grandfather. But the coincidence remains, and it's part of why this village is remembered at all. The name that made Döllersheim famous belonged to a family that had already left it behind generations earlier. The people actually displaced from Döllersheim and the surrounding settlements, together with thousands more uprooted across this part of the Waldviertel, remain known mainly to their own descendants and to local archives. If you want to see more places like this, towns erased not by time, but by decision, subscribe. There are more of these stories to tell.